Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the elections in the United States. Donald Trump has won. The Democrats have been comprehensively defeated. So what explains the result? What are the implications for the US and the wider world? Hello, my name is Alan Rinnick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. We're now a week on from the elections in the United States. Donald Trump has won the presidency, the Senate, and almost certainly, though as we record this, yet quite definitely, the House of Representatives. With such a clean sweep against Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party, there has been much discussion and debate around what happened and what the future holds for both parties. And, of course, there are big questions about future policy directions and their implications around the world on climate, tariffs, democracy, Ukraine, the Middle East, China, and much else. Well, to make sense of where these debates have got to, I'm delighted to be joined today by two of my colleagues with great expertise on US politics and policy. Dr. Thomas Gift is Associate Professor in Political Science, and Dr. Julie Norman is Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations, both here in the UCL Department of Political Science. Thomas is also Director of CUSP, the UCL Centre on US Politics, while Julie is its Foreign Policy Lead. Thomas and Julie, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you on again. And let's begin by looking at where we've got to in the debate around explanations for the election outcome. A week on from the vote, what do we know? What do we not know? Where's our sense of things going? Thomas, do you want to start off?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that this was really a resounding victory for Donald Trump and the Republicans. Donald Trump took every single swing state and improved his margins from 2020 in nearly every county across the country, which is really quite remarkable. And not only that, we also saw a lot of success down ballot for Republicans taking control of the Senate, and it looks like it's going to have the House as well. So it's hard to write a better script, I think, if you were Donald Trump and his supporters. Thinking about why this happened, one of the big issues is simply that there is an anti-incumbent sentiment. And I don't think that that's unique to the United States. We also saw that here in the UK, but that was a big headwind against the Democrats. Another issue was the economy. Inflation, despite the fact that it has cooled considerably in the last several months. Still, if you look at prices compared to pre-pandemic, they're up about 20 to 30%, particularly when it comes to food and groceries. And I also think that Kamala Harris simply didn't run as effective of a campaign as she could have. We can get into that more later.
Well, I'm intrigued. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that she really tried to make this election a referendum on democracy. She said that democracy was at stake. And if you look at the data, it seems like a majority of Americans did think that democracy was at risk in this election. But if you look at how many of them prioritize it as the number one issue, it was only about 2 to 3%. And so she kind of banked her entire campaign on the fact that Donald Trump was going to threaten the very existence of the republic. And I think that by and large, voters just didn't have.
Really? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of it. And I think for people listening to the show with political science interest or background too, I think the results can be analyzed from a lot of different levels. These global trends that Thomas talked about, that not only here in the UK, but really around the world, we've seen most governments flip or incumbents kind of take a hit. Nationally, Biden had his own flaws, stayed in the race for a long time. Many Democrats feel if he had, that he himself was just an unpopular incumbent that Harris could not really unlink herself from and make a strong case that she would be, a case for change. You can look at the campaigns and what they chose to do or not, and just the individuals and, some of the sociology behind how people were attracted or unattracted to one candidate or the other. So I think there's lots of layers here, and there's no right or wrong answer, I think, just a lot of different layers. I will say to the campaign, to pick up where Thomas left off, Harris did zero in on democracy as one of her main issues, which I think was sort of overlearning the lessons from the 2022 midterms, where the Democrats overperformed in that election very much on that democracy message. But people who come out for midterms are sometimes different than the masses that come out for the presidential election. the other thing she really put all her focus on was abortion and really trying to get this women's vote out around this issue. Again, that worked in the midterms in 2022 for Democrats, but I think was just not as salient for voters as Thomas mentioned, the economy, more kitchen table issues that resonated a bit more broadly. So I think just some of these issues that they thought would be their linchpins just were not what voters were fully focused on.
And you mentioned there Biden's flaws. I mean, for many of our listeners, Trump had extraordinary flaws as well, and unique flaws in this election. Were they not also important?
Well, absolutely. And I think that there were many who voted for Trump who were representative of the MAGA base, who really were attracted to his charisma, to this kind of anti-elite sentiment that he brings in, this sense of kind of standing up to the establishment, standing up to the elite, seeing everyday people. But there were a lot of people who voted for Trump that weren't super enamored by him, but just felt that he was the better candidate for the economy. He was the better candidate for change, and were just turned off from the Democrats for whatever reason.
I would agree with that. I mean, Donald Trump is a uniquely iconoclastic and charismatic figure. And he's known as the Teflon president because nothing sticks to him. And so scandal after scandal, allegation after allegation, he's really not hurt in the way that I think other politicians would be. We just heard so many times, one after the next, after the next, after the next, that Donald Trump was meeting his political demise, whether that was his first impeachment, whether that was his second impeachment, whether that was January 6th, whether that was the 2022 midterms when Trump-backed candidates did very, very poorly. Donald Trump just exceeded expectations, and there's a certain core of supporters, I would say about 30 to 40% of the American electorate that are just not bothered by this.
30 to 40% of the electorate. I mean, that's a big part of the electorate.
It's a very big part of the electorate, and even a larger share, of course, of the Republican Party.
Yeah. So where do the Democrats go from here? How do the Democrats rebuild after such a big...
Well, it's certainly a challenge, and they're going to have to start from the ground up, and there's certainly going to be a postmortem, as there always is, when a party gets trounced in an election like this one. As I said, I do think that Democrats need to rethink their messaging on democracy. It was just not an issue that resonated with voters very much. I also think that Democrats have just shifted too far to the left on too many social and cultural issues. I think that is not necessarily reflective of Kamala Harris's positions or even Joe Biden's, but the party as a whole, whether that's issues of transgenderism, whether that's issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, whether that's even related to kind of positions on immigration. I think some of these issues really alienated a sizable fraction of moderate voters in America.
Well, I would say this is going to be a big debate around for Democrats, and it always is for Democrats when they lose, because they are this big tent party where they are trying to court moderates and centrists. On the one hand, Kamala campaigned with noted Republican Liz Cheney in a number of states, et cetera. But then they're also trying to get out the vote among progressives, among their more reliable base. And so often when they lose, there's this finger pointing by the left side of the party saying, you went too far to the center and were too worried about courting the moderates. And the centrist and the more moderate side saying, what Thomas just said, you were, too progressive in some of these policies that the party has really stood for the last several years. And I think Harris got herself in a bit of a bind because she was sort of trying to be all things to all people, and that can appeal to all people, but all people also can read the opposite of what you are trying to say also. So centrists see her as being too progressive, progressives see her as being too centrist. And so I think that approach backfired on her. But it's always an identity issue for the party, and they always struggle with this.
If I could just add also, I think Democrats have really lost the working class. And we saw Bernie Sanders come out just in the last few days to say that Democrats didn't spend enough time talking to normal, everyday Americans. There really has been a large-scale realignment in the electorate where Republicans are now the party of blue-collar workers, and they have also added significant shares at the same time of minority voters. I think there was this sense that among Democrats, demography is destiny, and as the country became more diverse, that these would naturally be coalitions that would support the Democratic Party. But it turns out that that's not necessarily true. And I think Donald Trump was very effective at tapping into that.
And one of the striking things, if you look at the election results, if you just look at the aggregate vote figures, then Trump's vote total is pretty much the same as it was 4 years ago, whereas Harris's vote total is way down on Biden's from last time. At least one interpretation that I've seen put on that is that basically a lot of the progressive voters who have been put off on issues such as the Israel-Gaza conflict and some other issues that they really care about just chose not to turn out for Harris this time, and that therefore, on that interpretation, it's actually kind of shoring up that vote that is really needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important point to make, but I would say they lost votes in a couple different demographics that often get lumped together, which is progressives and minority voters. And they did lose progressives. They lost a lot of younger persons' votes, especially in college towns, places that are usually much stronger for Democrats. And they also lost in the cities. So in Pennsylvania and Michigan, in the swing states, it wasn't always losing in the rural counties. It was that they didn't get the vote out enough in Philadelphia, in Detroit. And a lot of those voters, some are progressive, but some are, yes, minority voters, but often with more moderate or conservative positions. And so I think the party has often conflated those groups in ways that are maybe not as accurate. And as Thomas said, a working class message is something that maybe has kind of fallen by the wayside.
It really reflects the fact that these elections now are really about mobilizing the bases, and it's about sort of the ground game. And I do think that there was an enthusiasm gap between what should be, or the core supporters of Kamala Harris versus those of Donald Trump. I really think that we're in this era, kind of a post-persuasion politics, where neither party is making an effort to reach out and court the center. Instead, it's all about ensuring the bases turn out to vote.
But in a sense, the working class electorate is now the mobile bit of the electorate, the bit of the electorate that could potentially move between parties, isn't it? I mean, I guess I'm looking at this from my sort of British politics angle and thinking that what you're saying sounds very similar to the Labour Party's diagnosis after 2019 of what they had got wrong and what they needed to change in order to win again. And so their strategy was very much around winning back working class and sort of aspirational middle class voters who had traditionally voted for the Labour Party but switched over to Boris Johnson's Conservative Party because they just felt that Labour was no longer speaking to ordinary folk like them. But that is now the bit of the electorate that is capable of moving between the Labour and Conservative parties in the UK. And I guess also, unless I'm just totally misinterpreting what happens across the pond, the Democrat and Republican parties in the US as well.
Yeah, I think it largely is. I mean, and everything we've been saying has touched on that. And I think in 2020, that was certainly the instinct for Joe Biden, trying to be, Union Joe, Scranton Joe, and trying to mobilize those bases. And to some degree that worked. But I would say, as Thomas started out our conversation noting, Harris lost across almost all demographics. So, in suburbs and more affluent cities. So, yes, the working class is that swing demographic, but other demographics also, the suburbs, women, these other demographics that they thought would come out for Democrats were also lagging behind. The other thing I'll just note too is we should just remember too, 2020 was a different election in the sense that it was COVID. There was a lot more mail-in ballot. There was a lot more voting turnout logistically in that one too. So I think that should be a little note when we look at the numbers.
What about the Republican Party, Thomas? Where is it? Is it now the pure Trump party, the pure MAGA party? Is the old Republican Party dead?
I think it is. I think Donald Trump has completely dominated this party, and it really is the MAGA party. This is sort of the MAGA-verse. I mean, Donald Trump exerted a tremendous amount of influence on Republicans on Capitol Hill during his first administration. Even when he was out of office, most Republicans were hesitant to challenge him or critique him. We saw in the primaries, Donald Trump cleaned up. It wasn't even close. You think about some other candidates who, on the face of it, might have had a chance, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, and others. It really wasn't much of a contest. Trump took Iowa, he took New Hampshire, and then the rest of it was over. So this is the party of Trump, and I think that these kind of so-called moderate Republicans are more or less an endangered species.
Yeah, and I would just say, we're seeing that not just at the executive level, but also in Congress and the congressional leadership that's taking shape as well. So in the Senate, we have an outgoing Republican leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, who is sort of a stalwart of the older traditional Republican brand, who looks like he'll most likely be replaced by Senator Rick Scott, who's much more in the Trump more MAGA leaning side of the party. So even the institutions that are not the president, I think we'll see much more of a bent towards a MAGA sort of ethos and approach to things.
I guess this has implications for what now happens now that Trump is entering power and what the policy directions are going to be for this administration. And maybe we should start, Julie, on foreign policy implications, which will obviously be of direct relevance to many of our listeners. We've heard a lot about Trump's approach to Ukraine and NATO, and suggestions that he wants to do a quick deal and get out, essentially. What should we expect?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would just remind listeners is that Trump is unpredictable. So some things that he says or that we, think he might do, often that changes pretty quickly. But on Ukraine, we do expect that he will want to, wind down U.S. support for the war, which has been largely military aid, and try and get to some kind of deal between the parties. Now, notably, in his first call with Putin, he did apparently tell Putin, don't escalate this war further, kind of this idea of we are trying to get it to wind down. But it's more the deal that I think Trump is willing to push the parties towards, one that I think Europe certainly would see as very much in Putin's favor, a land for peace sort of arrangement where Ukraine would essentially cede Crimea, cede the Donbass in exchange for peace, and probably halt any pathway to NATO accession or NATO membership as well. So my guess is that's what we're looking at in terms of what Trump envisions as a negotiated settlement. And we'll see how that actually plays out, and if he can, if he can convince the parties to move in that way or not, and what that means for Europe.
So, but by the parties, you mean the parties in the United States?
I meant Ukraine and Russia.
Uh-huh.
If Zelensky would even entertain the idea of negotiating on these terms, even if Putin would be open to negotiations at this point. So I think, it'll Trump will have obviously leverage on both of them, but at the end of the day, the deal will ultimately be between the parties in the war. So
okay, and so within the United States, we're presuming that Trump gets his way. There's no.
I think the fact that Trump will likely have control over both houses of Congress, it's unlikely that any further military aid from the U.S. will be forthcoming for Ukraine in any kind of meaningful way. And that will be the pressure or the leverage that the U.S. has over Ukraine to push towards negotiations.
Now, you're an expert, Julie, not just on the United States, but also particularly on the Middle East. What can we expect from a Trump presidency? Yeah,
so again, I mean, Trump doesn't like a lot of international wars, entanglements that the U.S. might get drawn into. So I do think he's going to want, say, the Gaza war, the Lebanon war to wind down. But again, it's the terms on which he is willing to have those wars wind down that will look a lot different from even the Biden administration. It's likely that Trump would be absolutely fine with Israel maintaining either a military occupation or even settlements in Gaza. And I think even more, probably with more impact is the West Bank. So we even just heard yesterday from Israel's finance minister saying, Trump is in office now, we can go ahead and start annexing parts of the West Bank like we've been essentially waiting to do. That's something that was sort of on the table at the end of Trump's first term, and something that I would imagine him kind of giving carte blanche for Israel to do at this point. So all those moves would kind of push a two-state solution much further away. I think Trump will also be much tougher on Iran, though again, that relationship kind of remains to be seen. But I think we can see a return to maximum pressure and support for Israel to take whatever actions they deem necessary in terms of Iran.
How will these kinds of policies go down with, I should say, its allies around the world? So many countries have been trying to achieve this very delicate balance in the Middle East between supporting Israel, but on the other hand, not allowing Israel to do just whatever it wants to the people of Gaza and Palestine more broadly. And I mean, it sounds like you're suggesting that with Trump, Israel can just kind of go ahead and do what it wants. That's going to be really difficult for many governments to accept, I mean.
It may be, but I would say that the U.S.'s policies in the region have been unpopular with many other countries up till now as well. They were unpopular before under Trump. And again, a candidate or a president who sees things through a more unilateral lens, through a more America First lens, the idea of maybe upsetting allies is probably not going to be his number one concern for the decisions that he makes and where he sees U.S. interests aligning most with, say, Israel's or other allies in the region.
And given your expertise on the Middle East, what are the implications of the implementation of such a policy agenda on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I do want to qualify is that I don't see Trump trying to implement his own policies so much as giving a green light to the right-wing government, say in Israel, to move forward with policies they've been kind of having ready for a while. And as I suggested, this would likely make any kind of two-state solution, any kind of Palestinian self-determination in a kind of meaningful way that would push that much further down the road and perhaps even make it, close to impossible if some of these moves go forward.
And doesn't that just mean the continuation of strife? Maybe my view of this is too simplistic, but I can't see how anything a two-state solution could deliver peace in that part of the world. And if we're moving further away from it, then that sounds like bad news.
It certainly does. I mean, for people like myself who work in the region, there's a sense that, as long as the occupation is ongoing, as long as any kind of meaningful movements towards a peace process are continually postponed or made impossible, that's just going to mobilize resistance kind of indefinitely. No matter how many times you hit Hamas, you hit Hezbollah, other groups will emerge in their wake as long as there's still this grievance and the sense of either occupation or complete takeover. I will say, Trump is also very savvy about working with Arab states, though, in the region. He's likely to want to get Saudi Arabia in on a deal. And I think if he feels he has the cover of Arab states, then that's something that I think he believes will maybe ameliorate some of these moves. But it's unclear if those states would go along with things that are more far-reaching.
Yeah. China, I guess, is the third big foreign policy area that we ought also to talk about. Really? Do you want to take us into that as well?
Yeah, I can maybe toss this one over to Thomas too. I mean, the main policy that Trump has articulated regarding China is in regards to tariffs. So, as many European listeners might be aware, Trump has talked big about tariffs across the board, 10 to 20% for all countries, but up to 60% for China. So definitely reigniting or kind of giving another boost to that trade war that has been ongoing. And I think other policies around China are kind of yet to be seen with how he would approach beyond that. But the tariffs pieces, I think, is something he can and will do relatively quickly. Maybe not to that level, but tariffs are something the president can do pretty easily.
Yeah, the president can take those actions unilaterally. And we saw in Trump's first administration that he was not shy about imposing tariffs on China, that it was very turbulent, very volatile, and very unpredictable. Upwards of 60% tariffs on imports from China is hugely significant. It would exacerbate inflation in the United States because these costs are eventually passed on to consumers. But I don't think this is just cheap talk from Trump. Some of the things he talked about in the election, of course, he just said to get elected. But this is one area where he's been very ideologically consistent, dating back 1980s, 1990s, when he was talking about China eating America's lunch and not playing by the rules.
I find this really intriguing because, so many people are talking about the big lesson from this election is that voters hate inflation. And yet he seems to be proposing a very inflationary policy. As you say, these tariffs would have a huge impact on the prices paid by American voters in the shops if they were implemented. But nevertheless, you think that he's willing to push it through.
I absolutely think that he's willing to push it through. And you're right, there is certainly an irony there that Americans want inflation and prices to be curbed. And yet much of Donald Trump's agenda is inflationary. He's proposing high spending. Current federal debt is about $35 trillion. Most estimates show that his budget, if it were all passed, would increase that by about $7.5 trillion during the course of his presidency. He's talked about mass deportation of immigrants, which of course would constrict the labor supply, increase prices even further, and then the tariffs. The tariffs are really the big issue. I mean, most data suggests that for typical middle-income family, over the course of the year, their bundle of goods that they would purchase would go up about $4,000 to $5,000.
Wow. And is that across all the tariffs that he's talked about? So we've talked mainly about the China ones there so far, but he's also proposed tariffs on imports across the whole world at lower levels, sort of 10 to 20%.
Absolutely, yeah. 10 to 20%, whether that's Canada or Mexico or the UK for that matter.
And you think he'll do that? Because I mean, I've heard lots of people thinking, yeah, actually, he's not. You think he's on this?
I'm less convinced that they will reach levels of 10 to 20%. Might be smaller. At the same time, there are all sorts of exemptions that Trump has given to companies, firms, sectors in the past that are favorable to him. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of loopholes if he did impose this policy.
And you mentioned the deportation policy as well.
Well, Donald Trump certainly made, in addition to the economy, immigration one of his marquee policy platforms. And we remember during his first administration, he wanted to build the U.S.-Mexico border wall, and he promised that Mexico would pay for it. Well, Mexico never paid for it. Only about 2% of the wall ever got built, but he's re-upping this as a marquee agenda item, in addition to the fact that he wants to impose these massive deportations of immigrants while also strengthening the border. I think that these proposals to import millions and millions of undocumented immigrants is unrealistic, and it won't happen. Immigration is really one issue where both the Democrats and the Republicans want the issue more than they actually want to solve the problem, because they feel that it speaks to sort of core concerns within each of their respective bases. So do I expect that there to be more emphasis on immigration and border policy? Yes. But will Donald Trump's more ambitious goals be realized? I'm doubtful.
Many of our listeners will have heard of Project 2025, and a lot of people talking about this. Do you want to explain just quickly what that actually is, and how likely is it that that kind of policy agenda is going to?
So Project 2025 is a pamphlet, almost a blueprint for
it's a very big pamphlet, we should say.
900-page pamphlet.
900-page pamphlet, so we could call this a tome, I guess, would be more appropriate. That was produced by a number of Trump associates and former associates and published by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. And on all manner of different policies, whether that's abortion or immigration or the economy, it charts out a very right-wing vision for how the governing majority should pursue their goals. I do think, Alan, that this is one critique of Donald Trump that was unfair to him, simply because he really did not have anything to do with with Project 2025 itself. He on multiple occasions disavowed it. Are there elements of Project 2025 that he will pursue? Yes, but those are largely, like tax cuts, like deregulation and so on. But those are largely kind of standard Republican orthodoxy. So I think Democrats had a lot to critique Donald Trump on. I don't think that they needed to invent things to criticize him, but they did think that this had would allow them to get quite a lot of distance.
I was one element in Project 2025 that I do think has some concerns regarding Trump is it is a bit of a blueprint for not exactly draining the swamp of big government, but more moving some of the control on government into the executive and it kind of within the direct control of the president. So kind of gutting some of the departments, but putting a bit more under the direct line of the presidency. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see that happening under Trump, given the indications that he's made, moves to close some of the departments, kind of moves to rejiggle things a little bit in his interest. So I do think that part matters.
And we haven't mentioned climate policy. We're speaking in the middle of a COP.
Yeah, I mean, climate is an issue that obviously bridges both the domestic and the international. And I think domestically, we'll certainly see an unwinding of different regulations that the Biden administration has put in place, certainly a weakening of institutions like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, probably some de-investment, so to speak, in some of the green energy that's been building over the last few years. globally, that will obviously have ramifications as well. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump withdraws from the Paris Accords once again, which he did in his first term. Different kinds of pressures on allies and support for companies and corporations that prefer, say, fossil fuels to more renewables or green energy. So I do think this is going to have an impact on climate policy and in both the international and the domestic sphere.
And how much can Trump actually do in this sphere? Because quite a lot is done by the states and more local level of government in this area.
A fair amount is, but in his first term, I know he undid over 100 different environmental regulations that had passed more at the national level. A lot of Biden's key legislation had to do with green energy investments. And again, some of that's just good for business now that I think Trump might be convinced by some in the business community to leave some of those things in place. But in terms of regulations and where business would like to see some of those undone, a lot can still be done at the national level around that.
Final question to both of you. Many of our listeners will be concerned about the future of democracy in the United States. Should they be?
Well, I still think that American democracy is resilient. And we did see that in 2021 amid Donald Trump's contestation of the electoral results. By and large, institutions held. January 6 rioters, many of them are in prison now. Donald Trump's baseless claims of election rigging mostly winded their way through the states and through the courts, where most were summarily and correctly dismissed. Does Donald Trump represent a threat to kind of democratic culture and norms? Yes, but I think that that's different than saying that the United States faces an existential threat.
Yeah, I would mostly agree. Some of my students may have heard me talk about the difference between, say, procedural democracies and substantive democracies. And I do think there was a concern in the US going into this election that even the procedural side might be at risk if we had yet another massive contested election with people doubting just the integrity of the US electoral system. The fact that this election was fast, clean, that we're not having these weeks and months of litigation and contestation, I do think probably helps just the electoral system in the US stabilize and the trust in it stabilize a bit. The substantive, I think, is still yet to be seen. And I think it depends how much Trump actually leans into and implements some of these more authoritarian impulses that we've seen him kind of gesture at and hint at and sometimes even speak directly to. And if those come to pass, that will be a shift for as Thomas said, for kind of the democratic norms in the US. And I think that does reverberate internationally as well.
And can supporters of democracy in the United States do anything in the coming years in order to reinforce those norms?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say, I think this goes across both parties. And one thing I would even point out for the 2020 election is that many of Trump's supporters, felt they were defending democracy. Like if you talk to people who were active in the MAGA movement, then that is how they see it. So I do think that at the more grassroots levels, Americans are still very committed to democracy, whatever the aisle they're on or whoever they voted for. And I think this will be a time to kind of, recenter how people engage in politics and in quote unquote democracy, whether that's through more community things, through schools, through things that are just a bit more locally based, as well as through trying to make sure that their voices and opinions are represented nationally.
Well, we finish on a note of some optimism, at least. So thank you so much, Thomas and Julie. Because we've covered a huge amount of ground there, but it's so interesting to hear your expert perspectives on all of these different issues. We've been discussing the US election and its domestic and international policy implications with Thomas Gift and Julie Norman. Next week here on UCL Uncovering Politics, we'll be looking at fact-checking and free speech. Some social media companies fact-check posts and tag those deemed to contain misinformation. But reflecting free speech concerns, they typically exempt posts from politicians. We'll be looking at the rights and wrongs of such policies. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that and other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Kaiser Kang and Eleanor Kingwell Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.